For my CMM, I set out to investigate the relationship between visual stimuli and sound. They're collaborating with an artist to create an interactive exhibition that encourages participants to engage in a self-directed exploration of the connection between these aspects of sensory experience. The nature of this undertaking requires my collaborator to produce multiple artworks, communicate the artistic techniques used, and provide a subjective description of their themes. I would then compose a piece that reflects each of these elements individually, and find a way to present my composition alongside the artworks through an interactive exhibition. My role is as a composer as well as in facilitating the exhibition, the first of which involves responding to the demands of my collaborator through my composition, as well as regularly receiving and incorporating their feedback. My role in facilitating the exhibition involves determining how interactivity can be used to emphasize the relationship between visual elements and corresponding musical components, and sorting out the logistics for the presentation. The first step in this would be finding a collaborator, discussing our ideas for the project, and noting their specific artistic demands, followed by developing a plan based on our discussion, and some research into how artists have approached similar themes or ideas, and then composing a draft of my piece in Logic. Then I would meet with my collaborator, show them my piece, and receive feedback for my draft. I would then use this feedback to revise my draft. Finally, I would set up the exhibition and invite audience members to participate. This means that the project would take an approximate total of 43 hours to be carried out. Carrying out this project would require a variety of resources, including Logic Pro X, 4 speakers, watercolor paints, charcoal, an artist, 4 80 by 100 centimeter canvases, 4 easels, renting out a venue for 3 hours, a MacBook Air laptop, 4 auxiliary cables, and 3 converters, amounting to a total of £2,027 and 44 pence. However, this cost remains hypothetical, as I was fortunate enough to be able to source each of these through my school. The price points for each of these items are based off of their retail costs provided by online vendors, and the venue cost was based off of listings for a venue of similar size in my area. My initial inspiration was Radiohead's Kid Amnesia exhibition. This exhibition is a virtual environment accompanied by a dynamic soundtrack, whereas the participant navigates the exhibition, changes in visual stimuli correspond to musical changes. This experience caused me to acknowledge that the synergy between music and visual art could be used to provide a sensory experience that neither medium alone could replicate, leading me to ask how this could be applied to broaden the capacity for artistic expression. What concepts could be communicated solely through the combination of these mediums? Another notable aspect of this exhibition was that there are instances where, when leaving one area and approaching another, the audio of the previous area fades, while the audio of the next area becomes louder. This presents an interesting notion, as change in proximity to sources of audio could be used to alter perception of musical stimuli, adding another dimension of interactivity. However, by combining it to transitional areas, the exhibition overlooks how this relationship could be implemented to encourage participants to interface with the art in a more intentional manner. With these two ideas, I began to wonder whether the latter could be applied in real life. Through further research, I came across the performance of Drone Refractions by the Para Orchestra. This involved performers being distributed throughout the foyer of the Royal Festival Hall, with audience members being encouraged to walk among them in order to, as conductor Charles Hazelwood put it, allow audience members to cultivate their own sonic mix of the arrangement, proving that this could be facilitated in real life. Through synthesizing each of these ideas, I developed the conceptual basis for my project, an exhibition in which 4 sources of audio are paired with an artwork and placed at each corner of a venue. Each would play a part of a piece that is composed to reflect its respective artwork. Participants would move throughout the exhibition, with each musical component becoming more pronounced as they advance towards its corresponding artwork. The exhibition is titled Synesthesia, as it aims to use interactivity to emulate its namesake by emphasizing the relation between visual and audio experiences. Beginning this project, I faced 2 initial challenges, the first of which was deciding on a style of music and compositional technique that I could employ to meet the demands of my collaborator as well as this exhibition. The second involved the practical concerns of this presentation, including sourcing the required materials, finding a suitable venue, and setting up the exhibition. I decided that by adapting Brian Eno's interpretation of the ambient genre in his album Music for Airports, I could derive an appropriate stylistic approach. I found Eno's ethos of creating music as ignorable as it is interesting to be especially pertinent to the intentions of my undertaking. Though I don't wish for it to be ignorable, the subtle complexity intrinsic to this approach ensures that neither the music or the artwork dominate the other, rather having them exert equal influence on how the other is perceived. Secondly, I need a reliable way to convert aspects of visual stimuli into musical elements. I decided on centering my composition according to each artwork's respective subjects, use of colors, and visual composition. To justify how color relates to compositional characteristics, I drew from the experience of composer and synesthesiac Rimsky-Korsakov, who outlined how different colors correspond to different musical keys. I used the relationships he outlined to inform how the colors of each of the artworks would be implemented into my composition. To ensure the demands of my collaborator would directly impact my compositional choices, I decided to create a table listing each of the aforementioned aspects of the artwork that I would incorporate into my piece, as well as how they can be interpreted musically, and filled it out during my meeting with my collaborator and subsequent correspondences. In recognition of the need for there to be several distinct parts within my piece, as to be able to allocate one to each artwork, I decided to have my piece be separated into the following parts: harmony, melody, counter-melody, and bass. When interpreting this artwork into workable musical characteristics, I noted how the piece presents an aquatic environment at various depths, including depictions of marine life. The color palette of the work is limited to different shades of blue. However, it's used to form a noticeable gradient, with with the blue darkening as the depth portrayed increases. The harmony was composed for two software instruments, the classic pad and the Broadway Big Dreamer pad. The classic pad was chosen due to its warm, soft timbre and relatively consistent articulation, whereas the Broadway Big Dreamer pad was chosen for its darker timbre, which is complemented by more noticeable oscillations than its waveform. However, their long attack times and high resonance make them both especially viable for the harmony of an ambient piece. This choice was made to reflect the human relationship with the ocean, with the classic pad representing the comfort it can evoke, whereas the Broadway Big Dreamer pad communicates the foreboding provided by its depth and volatility. To communicate the theme of descent, I used Korsakov's color key relationships to inform my harmonic progression for the classic pad. For example, Korsakov described C major as being white. As such, I began the piece with an arpeggiated C major triad to represent the white sky above the water, later adding the 7th and the 9th from the octave below to foreshadow the upcoming descent. When composing for the Broadway Big Dreamer pad, I took a different approach. The notes played by the Broadway Big Dreamer pad are sustained for an extended duration and correspond to the root note of the chord being played by the classic pad. By having it harmonize with the classic pad in such a way, attention is directed towards the unique qualities of its sound rather than its tonal progression. This fits the intention of having it allude to sounds such as whale noises, which have a similar drone-like quality and are a defining aspect of the audible component of marine environments. The visual artwork that inspired the melody depicts an urban environment, making use of yellow and white charcoal to depict the outlines of buildings and their lights on a backdrop. The work has no clear focal point and attempts to provide an impression of an environment through the use of minimal detail. I chose to use the shimmering electric piano software instrument to play the melody. The warm timbre of the instrument, in conjunction with its reverberation, are reminiscent of the glowing light emanating from the windows in the corresponding artwork, and its relatively short attack time allows it to articulate notes in a more defined manner, making it ideal for the melody. Moreover, its audibly apparent synthetic qualities allude to the artificiality of urban settings, and its echo portrays the use of open space within the artwork. In composing the melody, I took into account the lack of a focal point within the related artwork through the use of atonality. I also incorporated the artwork's lack of symmetry through implementing a substantial amount of variation in the distribution of notes between melodic phrases, observable through the incongruences between bars 25 to 52 and 105 to 121. The artwork's effective use of minimal detail to portray an environment also influenced my composition, as I use it to inform the conservative placement of notes in the melody. Whereas the artwork that I use as inspiration for the counter melody depicts a dragonfly, and more broadly a small snapshot of a natural environment. The work features a restricted color palette, only using varying shades of aqua, a combination of green and blue, and has a clear focal point, with the dragonfly being in the center and the use of a symmetrical composition. I chose to use the muted clank key software instrument for the counter melody, as the timbre more closely resembles that of an organic piano, as I wanted to juxtapose it with the synthetic keyboard in the melody, using this contrast to highlight the comparatively natural sound of the keyboard as it relates to the theme of the corresponding artwork. To represent the lack of variation in the color palette of the corresponding artwork, as well as the degree of focus in its composition, I chose to compose the counter melody entirely in the key of F major, as Korsakov related it to the color green. I reflected the artwork's consistent use of detail through more condensed musical phrases, and the notion of symmetry is present in the artwork was represented through similarly structured musical phrases, as well as the use of leitmotifs. Finally, the composition of the bass part was informed by this artwork, which features the silhouette of a mountain range. The work similarly features a narrow range of colors, only using black and dark purple. Furthermore, it has a clear focal point and evokes a theme of contrast through the comparison between the two objects depicted, the sky and the mountains. For the instrumentation of the bass part, I chose to use the 90s stereo synth bass instrument. This decision was informed by the clear and consistent tone provided by the instrument, as well as providing somewhat of a, for lack of a better term, generic bass sound, which is in line with the simplicity of the corresponding artwork. One challenge that was unique to the composition of the bass part was the amount of time in which I was able to tailor it to the related artwork, as there was a relatively small window of time between the artwork having been completed and the scheduled date of the exhibition. I decided to overcome this by composing the piece in relation to the concept behind the artwork, rather than the artwork itself. Thus, this part alternates between patterns of general tonal ascent and descent, as can be observed in bars 85 to 105, in order to provide the impression of navigating mountainous terrain. Concerning my role in facilitating the exhibition, the most pressing logistical issue was figuring out how to allocate each part of my composition to 4 separate speakers. Initially, I searched for a technological solution to this issue, through the use of directional panning and a compatible set of speakers. However, I was unable to allocate 2 different parts to 2 separate speakers in the same sound system through the use of panning. Thus, I decided to resort to a much simpler solution. I gathered 2 more speakers and connected them to my peers' laptops and asked them to play different parts of the piece simultaneously, following a verbal cue. This comes with 2 issues. Firstly, a lack of coordination between my peers could result in the individual parts being played out of sync. Secondly, a lack of sophistication innate to this approach would hinder the first impressions of the exhibition. I addressed the first issue by practicing synchronizing our actions with my verbal cue, limiting room for error. To address the second issue, I decided to make new audio files of each part, including several repetitions with intervals of silence in between them. This allowed us to ensure that the parts were synchronized on the first repetition, then introduce the audience during the intervals between each part, providing the exhibition with the appearance of being seamless. As a last-minute decision, I chose to have the participants use their phone flashlights to illuminate the art exhibition, partially due to difficulties with lighting, but also to ensure that their ability to see a given artwork is dependent on their proximity to it. In light of the unprecedented nature and ambitious aims of this project, I feel that the exhibition was a successful enactment of my artistic vision, especially considering that most of the compromises made were regarding logistics and served mostly as inconveniences, though retrospectively, confronting these challenges earlier would have been benefited the exhibition. Moreover, audience feedback and my collaborators' response were overwhelmingly positive and indicated that interactivity enabled more substantial engagement with the artwork. Looking back, I'm very satisfied with the outcome.